as well as for his wife and baby if he cooperated fully as an informant. You could start a new life with a clean slate, Santini told him. Think about it. A good job with nobody hassling you. No concerns for another deportation. A nice car. A good future for your wife and child, free of MS-13. The prospect of remaining in the United States legally seemed to have an almost hypnotic effect on Diego, as he daydreamed about living in The prospect of remaining in the United States legally seemed to have almost an hypnotic The prospect of remaining in the United States legally seemed to have an almost hypnotic effect on Diego, as he daydreamed about living a new life in the States. As a legal resident, he wouldn't have to worry about the second glance of a police officer or the threat of deportation. He could have all the small things that most Americans took for granted, Santini told him. After so many years of the stress and brutality of gang life in Honduras, it seemed almost too much for Diego to even consider escaping. But his options were limited. He was running for his life. The gang had already murdered his father, sister, and brother for his failures in the eyes of MS leaders. Either he took his chances with the US government and became an informant, or he was very likely dead on arrival if he was deported back home. See, Diego finally told Santini after several days of prodding, I will cooperate. With a master's degree in criminal justice earned at John Jay College in New York, one of the country's premier law enforcement academies, Santini dove into the existing criminal literature about MS-13. He discovered a complicated, murky world involving international networks, prison systems, and cultish allegiance. What quickly became apparent was that inserting Diego as an undercover informant with the 20th Street clique would require overcoming a difficult set of hurdles. Typically, police informants were groomed because they already had access to the targeted individuals or had specific knowledge of their criminal activity, or both. The challenge for Santini in this case was that even though Diego was obviously a hardened MS-13 Marrero, he had no direct connection with the 20th Street clique. If he made unsolicited contact with them, the gang members were likely to be extremely wary. In the world of MS-13, it was highly unusual for an unknown Marrero In the world of MS-13, it was highly unusual for an unknown Marrero to just show up on the street without a local sponsor. The cliques didn't take in strangers. A call from an MS-13 sponsor in Central America usually provided notice to a clique about a member headed their way in the States. Without a sponsor, or even with one, it was normal for the gang to mandate a background investigation. The local clique where the visiting Marrero presented himself often initiated a check on his bona fides. This could consist of a series of phone calls to the new arrival's original MS-13 clique back home, family and friends, or even the dispatch of gang members to investigate and conduct interviews in person. One 20th Street thug who followed up on a suspicious hunch about Diego could easily spell his speedy death. Further complicating Santini's mission, some MS-13 cliques forced new recruits to prove themselves by committing acts of violence, serious acts of violence, on rival gang members as a pass or fail test to ensure they were committed and tough enough to hang with the homies. Underlying this test was an understanding that a rat working for the cops would be reluctant to perform a hit job. Somehow, Santini needed to safety orchestrate Diego's acceptance by the 20th Street clique without allowing him to commit any violence to prove himself worthy of the gang. Sitting at his desk on a Friday afternoon, Santini stared at the funeral card Cabrera had given him without a portrait of the boy Brian Martinez, shot and killed as he walked down a Mission sidewalk. A completely senseless murder. Something about the child's face troubled him. It was the sheer optimism, his expression of pure wonder, eyes shining wide and bright into the camera. Santini imagined the exact moment the boy's life was taken, when a car drove past and gunshots erupted and echoed down the street. He saw the youth drop to the pavement, fatally wounded and bleeding, struggling in his last moment to grasp the evil befalling him, wishing his mother or father were there to save him. On the agent's desktop, an entire series of crime scene photos was spread out. The boy's crumpled body and his spilled blood taken from every angle. Santini gathered the pictures in his stack and placed them in a case folder along with the funeral card. It was 5 o'clock on Friday, quitting time. The crowd at Blondie's bar in the Mission would soon be packed tight. The place served massively oversized martinis of every flavor known to man, served in big mason jars. Good musicians entertained the room from a stage situated smack dab in the middle, directly across from the bar stools. Usually, the women there were exceptionally attractive and frequently willing to flirt, just what the doctor ordered. He only needed to wave a finger at the familiar bartender who immediately knew what to prepare. A dirty martini with extra olive juice, saltier than hell, just the way Santini liked them. Taking his first sip as the band cranked too loudly for conversation, for some reason his mind turned to his father, though he rarely thought about the man any. Taking his first sip as the band cranked too loudly for conversation, for some reason his mind turned to his father, though he rarely thought about the man anymore. His parents' marriage had begun to crumble when he was about 10 years old and his father's alcoholism became apparent. Ground down by the daily commute from Long Island into Manhattan and the stress of a worker as a broker on the New York Stock Exchange, he quit the job with no plan to financially support the family. Santini's mother was working part-time at the Macy's in Massapequa and his father's Santini's mother was working part-time at the Macy's in Massapequa when his father quit. She started working full-time at the store to make ends meet. The fights between his parents grew increasingly frequent and loud. Santini would lie in bed, listening to his father yelling at his mother. The drunken tirades were laced with profanity. He began developing a hatred for the man with whom he used to be so close. Santini's older brother, now 19, had been practicing Taekwondo for several years. One night, while their father was drunk and yelling at their mother, Santini's brother intervened, warning his father he would kick his ass if he yelled at their mother again. A few weeks later, their father moved out of the house, never to return. The divorce was finalized within a year. As a teenager, Santini was engrossed in the heavy metal music of bands such as Metallica, Iron Maiden, and Black Sabbath. His taste later developed into a fascination with super heavy death metal bands like Slayer, Megadeth, and Death Angel, all of which were big favorites of the founders of MS-13 in Los Angeles too. He grew his hair long and traveled with like-minded friends to concert halls on Long Island and in New York City, including the famous CBGBs, guzzling booze and jumping into the mosh pit, often returning home battered and bruised. Things haven't changed much, he thought. He knocked back the martini and ordered another one as the loud music pounded the troubling memories. The next Monday morning, focusing on writing investigation reports, Santini began receiving email notices from ICE's Enforcement and Removal Operations (ERO) division regarding the 5 gang members recently arrested outside of Jocelyn's Bakery. According to the notices, the 5 homies currently held at the Yuba City Detention Center would be arriving at Immigration Court in San Francisco the next day for deportation hearings. Reading the message from ERO, Santini had an epiphany. Maybe the perfect way to introduce Diego to the 20th Street clique. Santini devised a strategy where he would arrange to have the 5 MS-13 gangsters transferred from the ICE detention center in Yuba City to the Sanson Street detention facility, presumably for immigration hearings. Once at the facility and locked up in a cell together, the gang members would be told the judge overseeing their cases had called in sick and the hearings were canceled for the day. The whole thing would be a ruse by which to introduce Diego to the clique. It seemed like the perfect setup. Santini rushed to postpone the transfer of the gangsters to Sansom for a week, buying himself time to orchestrate the trap. A week later, the 5 detained 20th Street clique members arrived at Sansom at the crack of dawn and were ushered into a cell rigged with hidden cameras and microphones. Diego arrived at the facility around the same time on a different bus and was locked up in a separate cell. Around 10 a.m., Santini and 2 other HSI agents brought Diego into an interview room to prep him for his meeting with the 20th Street crew. He was understandably nervous, having no idea if any of the MS-13 members he was about to meet had connections to his Los Leones Locos clique back in San Pedro Sula, where he was known as the gangbanger Tramposo, now green-lighted for death by the big homies. If the meeting with the 20th Street homies didn't go well, the US government would have no further use for him and would probably ship him back to Honduras. Santini coached him to be calm and assertive, to engage in conversation readily and not allow for any long, awkward silences. He needed to maintain a confident presence and quickly gain respect from the 20th Street crew. If the meeting started to go badly and it looked like he was about to get jumped, Santini instructed Diego to signal distress by placing both of his hands on his head, which would bring the HSI agents running to the rescue. Santini sat in the detention center control room, watching the security video from the cell that held the 520th Street homies. The picture was clear, but their voices were barely audible through the hidden microphones due to the outside traffic noise coming through an open window. If the agents were going to hear what the gang members said, the audio of their conversation would have to come later from another recorder hidden inside the ductwork. At 11 a.m., guards led Diego to the cell door and his handcuffs were removed. He paused for a moment and took a deep breath. This was it, his big entrance. Everything was riding on it for him. The guard swung open the cell door. "Que ondas, homies?" Diego said, stepping into the lockup. Inside the small cell, furnished with 2 benches, 4 of the 20th Street thugs sat, while Blackie stood in the corner, arms crossed and glaring. They all stared at Diego, sizing him up. The gangsters were still wearing the same all-blue street dress as the day they were arrested a few weeks prior. "I'm Little Loco from Honduras," Diego announced. "I'm with La Mara." "What clique you claim, homie?" Blackie said after a long, uneasy silence. This is where it got dicey for Diego. Knowing that the homies would grill him thoroughly before accepting him as one of their own, he had to give detailed answers without disclosing his real identity and getting caught up in a lie about his true gang affiliations in Honduras. He didn't know whom these mareros in the cell knew. He did, however, quickly detect that none of them were Hondurans, so he took a chance. "I'm from the Hollywood Locotes, Salvatrucha's clica in San Pedro Sula," he said. "The vato has the markings of the barrio," Spunky said, pointing to Diego's tattoos that peeked over the neck of his t-shirt. They fired questions at Diego about his past and his home clique. In his usual monotone voice, he gave them a careful mixture of truth and lies about his affiliations in Honduras, his leadership roles, and his criminal exploits there. He cleverly told them he had recently helped mastermind the Christmas Eve bus massacre outside the San Pedro Sula, a widely publicized incident that was already achieving legendary status within MS-13's He cleverly told them he had recently helped mastermind the Christmas Eve bus massacre outside San Pedro Sula, a widely publicized He cleverly told them that he had recently helped mastermind the Christmas Eve bus massacre outside San Pedro Sula, a widely publicized incident that was already achieving legendary status within MS-13's transnational grapevine. When Spanky asked him details about his tattoos, Diego took off his shirt, exposing his shoulders and torso, covered in Mara Salvatrucha ink. The 5 gang members rose in wonder to look closer at his tats as he stood like a golem in the center of the cell, turning and posing, an object of intense curiosity. Diego had more tattoos than all 5 mareros put together. They were mesmerized. After interrogating Diego about his trip from Honduras to Houston and from there to San Francisco, the group seemed satisfied that the new MS-13 marero in town was the real deal. Blackie told Cypher to give Diego his phone number so he could contact him when they were released from jail, adding that Cypher would be free within a matter of days because he had a good immigration lawyer. Blackie himself and the other 3 homies in detention would probably be deported to El Salvador, he said. Nevertheless, they would all sneak back into the States soon, Blackie promised. And they would see Little Loco on the streets when they returned. After leaving Diego in the cell to hang out for a few more hours to get better acquainted with the 20th Street homies, Santini had him removed by the guards. The agent's new informant had obtained a phone number and an invitation to meet additional members of the clique in the mission. From now on, as far as Santini was concerned, Diego would be a tool to pry open the 20th Street clique and take them apart. What Diego did on his own time, as long as it was legal, was his own business. But Santini would decide what was Diego's own time and what was the U.S. government's. And it wasn't going to be normal business hours, not by a long shot. Santini reiterated to Diego what was expected of him and what he would receive from the government in return. If he did his job and he helped bring down the 20th Street clique, he could start a new life in the States with financial support and protection from the gang. HSI would have his back on the streets to the greatest extent possible, but the work would still be dangerous. Diego already knew the risk he was taking. He knew the type of thugs he'd be dealing with. He had been one of them since the age of 15. Santini wrapped up the briefing with Diego and had him sign a litany of documents making him an official government informant. He told Diego that he could not make him any promises. The government was careful not to commit anything to informants. Diego knew he would have to work hard to take down the gang, his gang. He was assigned a source number and a fake name. Santini watched from the lobby of the federal building on Sampson Street as Diego exited onto the sidewalk and blended into the city. His name moving forward was no longer Diego. It was now Federal Criminal Informant number 1301, aka Little Loco.